rode up to the men of the 20th legion, and in a loud voice exclaimed that this was the time for wiping out the mutiny. "Advance," he said, "and hasten to turn your guilt into glory." This fired their courage, and at a single dash they broke through the enemy, and drove him back with great slaughter into the open country. At the same moment the troops of the van emerged from the woods and entrenched a camp. After this their march was uninterrupted, and the soldiery, with the confidence of recent successes and forgetful of the past, were placed in winter quarters. The news was a source of joy and also of anxiety to Tiberius. He rejoiced that the mutiny was crushed, but the fact that Germanicus had won the soldiers' favor by lavishing money and promptly granting the discharge, as well as his fame as a soldier, annoyed him. Still he brought his achievements under the notice of the Senate, and spoke much of his greatness in language elaborated for effect, more so than could be believed to come from his inmost heart. He bestowed a briefer praise on Drusus, and on the termination of the disturbance in Illyricum, but he was more earnest and his speech more hearty, and he confirmed too in the armies of Pannonia all the concessions of Germanicus. That same year Julia ended her days. For her profligacy she had formerly been confined by her father Augustus in the island of Pendatria, and then in the town of the Regni, on the shores of the Straits of Sicily. She had been the wife of Tiberius, while Gaius and Lucius Caesar were in their glory, and had disdained him as an unequal match. This was Tiberius's special reason for retiring to Rhodes. When he obtained the empire, he left her in banishment and disgrace, deprived of all hope after the murder of Postumus Agrippa, and let her perish by a lingering death of destitution, with the idea that an obscurity would hang over her head from the length of her exile. He had a like motive for cruel vengeance on Sempronius Gracchus, a man of noble family, of shrewd understanding, and of perverse eloquence, who had seduced this same Julia when she was the wife of Marcus Agrippa. And this was not the end of the intrigue. When she had been handed over to Tiberius, her persistent paramour inflamed her with disobedience and hatred towards her husband, and a letter which Julia wrote to her father Augustus, inveighed against Tiberius, was supposed to be the composition of Gracchus. He was accordingly banished to Corcina, where he endured an exile of 14 years. Then the soldiers who were sent to slay him found him on a promontory, expecting no good. On their arrival he begged a brief interval, in which to give by letter his last instructions to his wife Aliaria, and then offered his neck to the executioners, dying with a courage not unworthy of the Sempronian name, which his degenerate life had dishonored. Some have related that these soldiers were not sent from Rome, but from Lucius Asprenas, proconsul of Africa, on the authority of Tiberius, who had vainly hoped that the infamy of the murder might be shifted on Asprenas. The same year witnessed the establishment of religious ceremonies in a new priesthood, of the brotherhood of the Augustules, just as in former days Titus Tatius, to retain the rights of the Sabines, had instituted the Titian brotherhood. 21 were chosen by lot from the chief men of the state. Tiberius, Drusus, Claudius, and Germanicus were added to their number. The Augustal games, which were then inaugurated, were disturbed by quarrels arising out of rivalry between the actors. Augustus had shown indulgence to the entertainment by way of humoring Maecenas' extravagant passion for Bathyllus, nor did he himself dislike such amusements, and he thought it citizenlike to mingle in the pleasures of the populace. Very different was the tendency of Tiberius's character, but a people of so many years indulgently treated, he did not yet venture to put under harsher control. In the consulship of Drusus Caesar and Gaius Norbanus, Germanicus had a triumph decreed him, though war still lasted, and though it was for the summer campaign that he was most vigorously preparing, he anticipated it by a sudden inroad of the Chatti in the beginning of spring. There had, in fact, sprung up a hope of the enemy being divided between Arminius and Segestes, famous respectively for treachery and loyalty towards us. Arminius was the disturber of Germany. Segestes often revealed the fact that a rebellion was being organized, more especially at that last banquet, after which they rushed to arms, and he urged Varus to arrest himself and Arminius and all the other chiefs, assuring him that the people would attempt nothing if the leading men were removed, and that he would then have an opportunity of sifting accusations and distinguishing the innocent. But Varus fell by fate and by the sword of Arminius, with whom Segestes, though dragged into war by the unanimous voice of the nation, continued to be at feud, his resentment being heightened by personal motives, as Arminius had married his daughter, who was betrothed to another. With his son-in-law detested, and fathers-in-law also in enmity, what are the bounds of love between united hearts became with bitter foes incentives to fury. Germanicus accordingly gave Caecina 4 legions, 5,000 auxiliaries, with some hastily raised levies from the Germans dwelling on the left bank of the Rhine. He was himself at the head of an equal number of legions and twice as many allies. Having established a fort on the site of his father's entrenchments on Mount Taunus, he hurried his troops in quick marching order against the Chatti, leaving Lucius Apronius to direct works connected with roads and bridges. With a dry season and comparatively shallow streams, a rare occurrence in that climate, he had accomplished without obstruction rapid march, and he feared for his return heavy rains and swollen rivers. But so suddenly did he come on the Chatti that all the helpless from age or sex were at once captured or slaughtered. Their able-bodied men had swum across the river Adrana, and were trying to keep back the Romans as they were commencing a bridge. Subsequently they were driven back by missiles and arrows, and having in vain attempted for peace, some took refuge with Germanicus, while the rest, leaving their cantons and villages, dispersed themselves in their forest. After burning Matium, the capital of the tribe, and ravaging the open country, Germanicus marched back towards the Rhine, the enemy not daring to harass the rear of the retiring army, which was his usual practice whenever he fell back by way of stratagem, rather than from panic. It had been the intention of the Cherusci to help the Chatti, but Caecina thoroughly cowed them, carrying his arms everywhere, and the Marsi who ventured to engage him he repulsed in a successful battle. Not long after, envoys came from Segestes, imploring aid against the violence of his fellow countrymen, by whom he was hemmed in, and with whom Arminius had greater influence, because he counselled war. For with barbarians the more eager a man's daring, the more does he inspire confidence, and the more highly is he esteemed in times of revolution. With the envoys Segestes had associated his son, by name Sigemundus, but the youth hung back from a conscience of guilt, for in the year of the revolt of Germany he had been appointed a priest at the altar of the Ubii, and had rent the sacred garlands and fled to the rebels. Induced, however, to hope for mercy from Rome, he brought his father's message. He was graciously received and sent with an escort to the Gallic bank of the Rhine. It was now worth while for Germanicus to march back his army. A battle was fought against the besiegers, and Segestes was rescued with a numerous band of kinsfolk and dependents. In the number were some women of rank, among them the wife of Arminius, who was also the daughter of Segestes, but who exhibited the spirit of her husband rather than of her father, subdued neither to tears nor to the tones of a suppliant, her hands tightly clasped within her bosom, and eyes which dwelt on her hope of offspring. The spoils also taken in the defeat of Varus were brought in, having been given as plunder to many of those who were then being surrendered. Segestes too was there in person, a stately figure, fearless in the remembrance of having been a faithful ally. His speech was to this effect: "This is not my first day of steadfast loyalty towards the Roman people. From the time that the divine Augustus gave me the citizenship, I have chosen my friends and foes with an eye to your advantage, not from hatred of my fatherland, for traitors are detested even by those whom they prefer, but because I held that Romans and Germans have the same interests, and that peace is better than war. And therefore I denounced to Varus, who then commanded your army, Arminius, the ravisher of my daughter, the violator of your treaty. I was put off by that dilatory general, and as I found but little protection in the laws, I urged him to arrest myself.